Welcome to the, now that we're on the fourth Tuesday, I have to think about it a while, the October meeting for the Internet Developer Group. This is going to be a very interesting meeting. I think if you think about the things that are going on the Internet right now, messaging has become a very hot topic. A lot of people are interested in all the different ways, and if you look at the things that Park's doing, other people, you have a lot of people concerned about SMS and instant messaging, and it just seems that that's really the running thing. Before we get into it, I was going to just tell people we've now hit over 41,000 people look at our archive, so we continue to be a point of contact on the net for people that want to know about technology. Hooray! Our speaker tonight is well qualified to discuss the topic of messaging, and not from the hype standpoint. Terry Olkin is the CTO and co-founder of Sagaba. And if you want to know what Sagaba is, if you're into the encryption game, Sagaba was a machine used by the United States in the Second World War that was never cracked. And so when you think about messaging, that's a good thing, right? You don't want to get cracked. Sagaba is in the business of building enterprise messaging systems. It could be email, it could be instant messaging, it could be EFT, I guess, financial statements and things like that. But how do you do that securely? And that's his main focus. In today's world of viruses and blasters and everything else, I think it's becoming everyone's main focus to try and do things securely. Before that, he was with Open Horizons. He was the VP of Engineering at Open Horizons, and it was interested in doing real-time messaging. I'm trying to understand how much more real-time messaging can be than instant messaging, but maybe there's a way to. Maybe he was stopping the boat from hitting the dock as it was coming into the slip. He held managerial and technical positions over a 6-year period at Oracle, and was one of the founders of their advanced technology division. And before that, he worked for Microsoft and developed persistent XML and enterprise messaging, persistent storage, a lot of the things that Microsoft is finally talking about. Terry talked to them about many years ago, and maybe the echo's coming off the wall, and they're finally hearing them. So this should be a very interesting presentation, and we'll see if instant messaging can be done safely. Terry Olkin.
Thanks for having me here. I'll also say the reason we came up with Sagaba is because at the time Sagaba.com was one of the few domain names actually available. Go back to 2000 and try to figure out how hard it was to find a domain name. Spend weeks. That's the first thing you do in a startup. As far as Microsoft, I always thought that they had bugged my office. Every time I came up with an idea, then next thing I knew, Paul Allen had a product around it. So I stopped doing that. But anyway, we started Sagaba about 4 years ago, almost, and basically we're doing secure messaging generally. In this talk, I'm going to not talk about Sagaba. I'm going to talk about the focusing on instant messaging. And when I originally talked to Bill, we had this this idea of talking about instant messaging in terms of where it's going with the net, is it the future, and so on, but also in terms of why is it where it is, and what's going to prevent it from getting there, and kind of this idea of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So trying to make this talk a little entertaining as we go through it. Well, what I'm going to do is I basically have a set of topics, and for each one I'm going to go through the good, the bad, and the ugly, and not necessarily in that order. So some will start at one end and some will start at the other end. But basically, these are the things I'm going to cover. This isn't a big group, so if you have any questions, in the middle, you can just feel free to interrupt, and we can answer the questions as we go along. And at the end too, we can field some questions there as well. But we're going to talk about standards in terms of IM, which is maybe one of the more controversial topics. I thought we'd start with that one. But it also is kind of important for some of these other ones. Interoperability is going to be a direct consequence of standards, as it turns out. We're going to look at productivity, and that's one of the big question marks with IM. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Security is, that's kind of where we focus on. So that's probably where I have the most to say, perhaps, about instant messaging and messaging in general. But I think that's going to be the barrier, as it were, to getting this thing going in the enterprise and making it real and doing business on it. Well, a little bit about cost and bandwidth. Again, there's some myths there, what's real, what's not. And then some things to look for if you're looking to deploy these things or not deploy them, or I'm in a weird building to be talking about some of this stuff. One of my ugly slides was going to be, well, I'm glad I didn't do it. But there's some things to look for as vendors if you're looking to buy these things. As vendors try to pitch them to you, and I'm going to maybe put some things out there that says hey, if they're telling you this, maybe you should think about it. Kind of the used car salesman trick there, and then come back to the future. But before we get started, I just want to. There's some words that even I've learned about this. I'm actually relatively new to instant messaging. Only been looking at it for a few years, and so there's some terms that people are using, and they have very specific meanings. And so I just want to make sure that, at least as I talk about them, you understand when I'm saying a certain word, what I mean, because I'll always use those words. A lot of people talk about IM as this general application of messaging back and forth, but it actually is composed of at least two, usually three separate type of things. Presence is really that part that gets you started. That's where you know whether somebody's online, what their status is, are they active, and so on. That's exemplified through buddy lists nowadays with a little icon, green, red, yellow, whatever. A lot of people say presence actually is the real killer app as far as what messaging is about. Is somebody on your cell phone? Are they at their desk? So on. It's knowing where somebody is, because you can then know who to contact. You don't have to waste time finding the right person if I know that person is at their desk or at their phone or so on. Especially as presence extends to the cell phones, which is starting to happen now. You're going to know more about where people are instead of less. And I think I'll come back to presence later on. So presence is one part of it. In fact, you can have presence all by itself. You don't actually need the messaging part of this. And some people say that's 90% of the application's usefulness is the presence part of it. IM in this instance, or in this case, or this way I talk about it, is an actual one-on-one conversation. So we're going, and some people use it as a verb. I'm going to IM you. That's now becoming, I don't know what the French are going to do about that, but that is starting to be a big issue. Is IM meaning one-on-one versus chat, where that's been defined to me, and I didn't make up these definitions, by the way, but I'm just going along with them. Chat is typically refers to more than two people involved in conversation, hence chat rooms, or converting an IM into a chat when you invite somebody else. So, but those are the three typical things you're going to find in most IM systems nowadays at a minimum. Then you get into some other things. Transcript. When I use transcript, that's a complete recording of the conversation. That'll come up later on in regulations and security. But transcript is a pretty important requirement if you're talking about IM in the enterprise. Security, generally, that's a big word. And being in the security business, I'm kind of particular about how that word gets used, because it gets thrown around a lot by people. And oftentimes they're using the word security, but they really mean often encryption. And encryption by itself is just not enough. Take anything away from this, encryption does not equal security. So when we talk about a secure system or a system that really should have security, we're talking about everything: authentication, privacy, integrity, authorization, non-repudiation, auditing, so on. All of those things together make up a secure system, not even any one of them or two of them. And finally, public IM. That's often referring to the public IM systems, AOL, MSN, and Yahoo, as opposed to the non-public IM systems. But just so that we're clear on what a public IM system. I mean, there's probably other smaller players out there, but quite frankly, we all know of these guys, and there's between them have like 2 times the population of the United States or something on there. So that's the public IM systems. And we're going to contrast that to the enterprise class ones later. Okay, so now let's get started. I'm going to first start with standards. And I don't remember which was which, so they'll all be surprises to me as far as where we start from. Okay, we're going to start with the good on standards, because there is some good. The good is that people are actually starting to talk about standards. They're starting to appear. The IETF has actually got some standards going. The two most popular ones out there are this SIP Simple standard and XMPP. The SIP / Simple standards, hard to say, are really being backed by IBM and Microsoft primarily through their products, Microsoft's RTC, real-time communication server, and IBM SameTime. XMPP is really being backed by this product called Jabber out of Jabber open source, and that is an XML-based standard. So that's the good news.
Do you have any preference between those two?
Yeah, I'll get to that. The bad news, that'll be the most controversial part of the talk, I'm sure. The bad news is, like all standards, there's more than one. And again, IBM Microsoft is backing one, Jabber and a bunch of others are backing the other. Now, Jabber sounds like this little tiny thing compared to Microsoft and IBM, but the fact of the matter is there are millions of people who are using Jabber-based IM systems now. So you got this thing where you just have the masses are using one, and then you have Microsoft and IBM are trying to push the other ones. And you know, the reality is I don't like either one, but I mean, myself, and I'll tell you that's really, to me, the ugly part. These aren't the right standards, either one of them. I'll tell you why. In my opinion, of course. SIP is, I mean, in the internet world, relatively old. I think it was a 1998 approved standard. It was really meant to do something else. It was meant to set up multimedia sessions between two or more clients. It's about a 150-page spec. And if you've read RFCs, you know that a 150-page RFC is pretty much unreadable. But it was there. I mean, it was a standard. And when you look at Microsoft, and I was there at a time when Microsoft was really just starting to take standards a little more seriously. I mean, they're the ones who really were pushing XML at the time. And I was actually working with one of the guys who was really leading that group in Microsoft. And it was actually a blow to Microsoft when he left and tried to form his own company, but then he took half of Microsoft with him, and then they sued him. And that got ugly. But
that's the ugly.
Yeah, but it was like I think their mentality is let's latch on to a standard that's kind of good enough, and let's go with that because it saves us time having to develop a standard. Plus, we look like good guys because we're getting into the standards. And this, by the way, I was also there right when the big antitrust trial was going on. So this was a big deal to be more standards and open and all that stuff. But SIP itself just doesn't do IM. It's not right. So Simple came along, which is SIP for instant messaging presence leveraging extensions. I mean, that probably took 3 months right there. But basically, this came along because they realized that SIP couldn't do the job. In fact, Simple is really taking one of the 8 or 9 commands available in SIP and saying, okay, let's really build this other thing around it, but it's still kind of like that. So it's like, if you're familiar with HTTP and there's, get, post, head, and all these kind of different methods, well, they picked one, because SIP is actually similar to HTTP in that sense, which is actually the good part of SIP, actually. And they basically said, okay, we're going to take this one little piece here. So of the 150 pages, we'll take like maybe 6 or 10 or whatever it is, and we're going to, that's our standard, by the way. And now we're going to make this simple thing, which is actually technically not a standard yet, but they're still working on it and so on. And so they're working on that. But I still personally think it's still not quite right because if you don't have the ability to start from scratch and you're trying to do something and you're dragging all this baggage along, I mean, we know what happens when you have standards designed by vendors who don't want to really start over and so on. So that's where we are with SIP and Simple. And then you have XMPP. Now, this is, I understand, the XML was the big thing, right? Everybody had to have their own markup language. That was it. I mean, there's XML for seeing eye dogs, there's XML for hearing, there's XML for for instant messaging.